You look at him, alone on a Sunday, no wedding ring, no noise in the kitchen, no one calling him back. You think, he must be lonely, but he's not. He's free, clear, untethered. He's not avoiding people. He's returning to himself. You call it loneliness, but to him, it's liberation. The man who used to be surrounded. There was a time. He couldn't walk into a room without being needed. He was the one everyone called when their car broke down, when their heart broke open, when their world fell apart at 2 a.m. He'd drop everything, no hesitation. Because that's what good men do. They show up, even when no one shows up for them. He was the provider, the planner, the pillar, the solid one, who never cracked, never snapped, never said, "I can't," Len. Because the moment he did, someone else might fall. So, he held it all. Birthday reminders, work deadlines, emotional labor no one saw. He was the man people leaned on, even when he was buckling inside. His calendar was always full. His phone never stopped buzzing. Group chats, work pings, family requests, last-minute favors. From the outside, he looked indispensable, important, put together, a man who mattered. But inside, he was tired, not just in his body but in his soul. Because being needed isn't the same as being seen. Being respected isn't the same as being understood. And being surrounded isn't the same as being loved. He was there for everyone, present, reliable, predictable. But when he needed presence in return, what he got was silence, deflection, discomfort. And slowly, something inside him began to whisper, "This isn't love, this is utility." But he ignored that voice. He told himself, "This is just life. This is what men do. You carry it." Quietly, until one day, he stopped. Not out of anger, not even out of burnout, but because something broke, not loudly, but in a slow, sacred kind of surrender. He stopped answering calls that only came when someone wanted something. He stopped chasing connections that left him emptier. He stopped performing, and when he did, the crowd disappeared. No invitations, no last minute, "Can you help?" No. "Where have you been?" Just silence. And in that stillness, he realized the hardest truth of all. He wasn't seen by them. He was used by them. What he mistook for closeness was just convenient access. And for the first time, in a life that looked so full, he was alone. The silence that terrified him. At first, the silence was brutal. Not poetic, not peaceful. Brutal. It wasn't just the quiet of an empty room. It was the loud absence of meaning. No footsteps in the hallway. No clinking dishes in the sink. No voice asking, "Are you okay?" No one to kiss goodbye or come home to. Just the hum of appliances, the occasional creak of settling walls, and the echo of a man's thoughts, bouncing off corners he hadn't noticed in years. He tried to fight it, filled his time with noise. Podcasts, endless TV reruns, scrolling until his thumbs hurt, extra hours at work, even mindless errands just to feel needed again. But every time he stopped moving, the silence came back, like a wave, like a mirror. And he hated what it showed him, because for years he had worn titles like armor, husband, dad, boss, provider, the reliable one. But now, those roles were stripped away. And what was left? Just him. No applause, no validation, no responsibilities to hide behind. And that terrified him more than any breakup ever could. He realized he had spent so much of his life being useful, he had forgotten how to simply be, how to sit with himself, how to ask, "What do I feel?" without someone else's opinion to shape it, how to wake up and not perform. He thought silence meant something was wrong. That peace was a problem to fix. But slowly, painfully, he began to see the truth. The silence wasn't his enemy. It was his invitation to face himself, not as a role, not as a function, but as a man. It wasn't easy. Some nights, it felt like drowning, like being surrounded by air but unable to breathe. But each time he sat, with the quiet, just a little longer than the time before, he discovered something deeper. He wasn't afraid of being alone. He was afraid that without others to serve, he had no worth at all. And that lie was the root of everything. The shift from solitude to sovereignty. But something changed. Not overnight, not with fireworks or fanfare, but in quiet, slow, sacred increments. He stopped fearing the silence, stopped treating it like a punishment, and instead he began listening to it, really listening. At first it was strange, like walking into a room you've lived in for years, and noticing, for the first time, how the light hits the floor, how the walls breathe when the wind moves, how your own breath sounds when nothing else interrupts it. And in that stillness, he began to hear what had been buried for years. Not the voices of others, not the opinions, expectations, corrections, but his voice, raw, unfiltered, real. He didn't have to perform, didn't have to smile when he didn't feel like it, didn't have to shrink to make others comfortable, didn't have to translate his thoughts into someone else's language. He simply was, no longer a background character in his own life, no longer edited down to what was acceptable or safe. He was angry some days, tender others, lost on Mondays, focused on Fridays, but whatever he felt, it was his, not filtered through someone else's agenda. And slowly, beautifully, what looked like being alone became something far more powerful, being whole. He started choosing what music to play, not based on who was around, but on how he felt. He ate when he was hungry, not when the clock said he should. He walked not to burn calories, but to feel the ground under his feet. And in doing less, he began being more. He wasn't escaping people. He wasn't giving up on love. He wasn't bitter. He was returning. Coming home not to a house, or a woman, or a title, but to himself. He realized sovereignty isn't about control. It's about alignment. It's about living in a way that doesn't betray your soul. It's about moving without apology, resting without guilt, leading yourself before asking anyone to follow. And once a man tastes that kind of inner peace, he no longer begs for permission. He no longer negotiates his values for company. He no longer fears the mirror. Because for the first time in his life, he belongs to himself. When you're not needed, you find what's necessary. For years, he was needed. At work, he was the one who stayed late, solved the fires, carried the weight no one else noticed until it dropped. At home, he remembered the anniversaries, took care of the bills, checked the locks, showed up for every moment, even when no one showed up for his. In relationships, he was the glue, the peacekeeper, the emotional first responder, always adjusting, always reaching, always trying one more time. And truth be told, he didn't mind. It made him feel valuable, anchored, worthy. Until one day, the texts stopped, the invitations dried up, the problems found new shoulders to lean on, and he was no longer needed. At first it crushed him. He walked through rooms that used to buzz with noise and heard nothing but the sound of his own thoughts. He checked his phone out of habit, but no one had asked for anything. No emergencies, no last minute, "Can you help me?" He sat in that space, feeling useless, discarded, like an old tool no longer required. But then, a quiet truth surfaced, one he had ignored for far too long. Maybe I wasn't truly needed. I was just being used. And that realization, it didn't sting. It liberated. Because if people only wanted him when he could give, then they never truly wanted him. So now, no one calls, no one leans in, no one expects him to carry their chaos. And for the first time, he can breathe. He can walk into his own life, not as a utility, but as a man. He can pour into his own cup, without apology, without guilt, without the pressure to prove his worth by emptying himself for others. And what he's found isn't loneliness, it's clarity. He found peace in not being essential to everyone else, because he finally became essential to himself. Not for what he could give, not for how well he could fix, but for who he is when no one is watching. And that, right there, is the beginning of a man reclaiming his soul. The myths about lonely men, they say he must be miserable. That's the first assumption, that a man who lives alone, eats alone, wakes up to no one, must be drowning in sadness, that his silence is sorrow, that his stillness is despair. They say he must be incomplete, because the world teaches that wholeness only comes in pairs, that a man without a partner is a man without purpose, that if he's not being wanted, He must be worthless. They say he must be bitter, broken, hiding, giving up. But they're wrong. He's not incomplete. He's unburdened. He no longer carries the weight of roles that demanded everything, yet gave nothing back. He's not hiding. He's healing. Not in a public display. Not in a forced journey of self-love wrapped in hashtags, but in quiet mornings, in steady routines, in the kind of emotional rest that only solitude can offer. He's not bitter. He's just done. Done chasing applause for playing roles that never fit. Done twisting his truth just to keep the peace. Done sacrificing clarity for companionship. And no, he's not sitting in darkness. He's sitting in clarity, in light, in spaces where no one's performing, no one's pretending, and no one's pressuring him to be more than human. Because what the world calls loneliness, he's learned to call something else entirely. Peace. Real peace. Not the kind that comes with a vacation, not the kind that depends on someone else's approval, but the kind that roots itself in stillness, grows in honesty, and thrives in a life that no longer needs to be explained. Yes, there are nights he remembers what closeness felt like. Yes, there are moments when a soft voice or a warm hand would be welcome, but those moments pass, and what remains is the unshakable knowledge that his peace is not a placeholder. It is a prize, earned through fire, claimed through clarity. So the next time they say, he must be lonely, let them. He no longer corrects that story, because the men who know, loneliness isn't the absence of people, it's the absence of peace. And he has peace, so he has everything, what he's building now. Now he wakes up early, not because someone needs him, but because he wants to be awake for his own life. No alarms blaring, no one pulling him in 5 directions, just the soft light through the window, and a man who finally has time to breathe. He drinks his coffee slow, not to rush out the door, but to savor the quiet, to sit with his thoughts, not run from them. He takes walks without a destination, no smartwatch to measure his pace, no route mapped out, just steps, and the simple miracle of movement. He's reading again, not headlines, not updates, but books, stories, ideas that stir something in him, things he used to love before the noise took over. He's rebuilding his body, not for compliments, not for attention, not for one last shot at dating, but to feel strong in his own skin, to feel steady, capable, rooted. He doesn't post about it, doesn't flex in front of mirrors. He just lifts, moves, stretches, and thanks his body for still showing up after everything. He's learning new things, not to get ahead, not to compete, but simply because curiosity returned when pressure left. He's saving money, not to impress, not to prepare for some big status move, but because having options gives him peace. And peace is priceless. He plans quietly, takes notes, organizes drawers nuances, not because he's bored, but because order outside helps him feel calm inside. And here's the part they won't understand. He's not doing any of this for a comeback, not for revenge, not to win the breakup, not to become the kind of man someone regrets losing. He's doing it for someone far more important. Himself. For the man who was always there, but always overlooked. Even by him, the man who showed up for everyone, but never sat long enough with his own reflection to ask what he needed. Now, he builds slow, he builds small, but he builds sacred. Not a house, not a brand, not an image, but a life. Quiet, simple, meaningful, where he no longer disappears inside of someone else's expectations. He's not chasing change, he is the change. He doesn't need to be understood anymore. He used to explain, used to reach for words, to soften the silence, to fill the awkward glances people gave when they realized he lived alone and liked it. He used to say, "I'm okay. I'm not lonely. I just like the quiet now." He said it gently. He said it kindly. He said it hoping someone, anyone, would get it. But they didn't. They furrowed their brows, changed the subject, laughed it off, or worse, looked at him with pity, as if peace were a problem that needed fixing. So for a while, he tried to make them comfortable, tried to explain why he wasn't dating, why his phone didn't ring on weekends, why he didn't put himself out there more. He tried to defend his stillness in a world obsessed with noise. But now, he's done explaining. He's done convincing. Done justifying his joy to people who only understand happiness when it comes with someone else's name. He's lived enough life to know two things. Most people only understand you through the lens of their own wounds, and most will project their fears onto your freedom. They're not asking because they care. They're asking because they're uncomfortable with your peace, with your presence, with the fact that you no longer need their approval to feel whole. So now, he just nods, smiles, says, "I'm good, thanks," then goes home, to his books, his music, his solitude that's not empty but full of clarity, full of breath, full of self-respect. They call it loneliness. He calls it alignment, because the life they quietly pity, the one with no birthday parties, no couple photos, no weekend getaways, that's the very life he once prayed for. Not the isolation, but the sovereignty, the ability to choose what enters his space, to say no without guilt, to live slow, to love small, to be his own peace without asking the world to bring it to him. And once a man gets to that place, he doesn't need to be understood, because he understands himself, and that is more than enough. To the man who chose solitude, not out of bitterness, not out of fear, but out of clarity, this is for you. You didn't run away. You walked away from noise, from pretense, from being half seen and half loved. You didn't collapse. You let go of the roles that drained you, the people who never stayed, the rooms where your silence was always misunderstood. You didn't quit on love. You simply stopped begging for it in places that demanded your sacrifice but never offered you safety. You are not lonely. You are liberated. You are not broken. You are rebuilt from the inside out, with patience, with honesty, with no one watching but your own reflection. You are not forgotten. You are finally free from needing to be remembered by those who never truly saw you in the first place. You've found peace in your own breath, strength in your own stride, meaning in your own mirror. You've stopped performing, stopped waiting, stopped asking for validation from a world that mistook your sensitivity for weakness and your masculinity for threat. You chose differently. You chose early mornings with no audience, quiet dinners with no expectations, slow walks that weren't for steps, but for stillness. You chose to rebuild, not for applause, not for attention, but for alignment. And that choice to choose you was the most courageous of all. You chose peace over pressure, depth over display, truth over titles. So let them call you lonely. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. Because you know something they never will. You are finally home. Not in a house, not in a relationship, but in yourself. And home is where you no longer have to earn your place. You are not waiting for rescue. You are not asking for permission. You are not healing for someone else's comfort. You're just living, fully, quietly, on your own terms. So to the man who chose himself, we see you, we honor you, we walk beside you, in silence, in strength, in sovereign peace.